Bold claims by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea on state media.
North Korea's first hydrogen bomb test was a complete success.
If true, it will be a significant leap forward in Pyongyang's nuclear capability. The underground test triggered an earthquake with a corresponding explosive output of 6 kilotons. That matches the output from DPRK's 3 prior atomic tests, but falls short of the thermonuclear blast of an H-bomb. Despite lack of confirmation, the move by North Korea is still raising concern and condemnation around the world, not the least of which its neighbor to the south. CCTV's Eugene Jung reports from Seoul.
South Korea's President Park Geun-hye chaired an emergency National Security Council meeting on Wednesday afternoon. Shortly after the DPRK announced they had succeeded in testing their first miniaturized hydrogen nuclear device.
There is a possibility that this would shake the Northeast Asian region's security landscape and would fundamentally change the nature of the DPRK's nuclear issue.
Earlier in the morning on Wednesday, Seoul's meteorological agency detected a 4.8 magnitude earthquake in the DPRK and concluded that it was man-made. They later said the seismic activity detected was very similar to that monitored in 2013 when the DPRK conducted its third nuclear test. The testing of a hydrogen bomb marks a step up in destructive power from the plutonium used in previous tests. The last one in 2013 was widely condemned by the UN Security Council. But the latest move suggests Pyongyang has little regard for the diplomatic costs.
We will take all possible measures, including further United Nations sanctions, by closely cooperating with the international community, including our allies and countries of the six-party talks, so that DPRK will pay the price for the nuclear test.
It was still business as usual in Seoul for ordinary people, although some did express concern over rising tensions on the Korean peninsula.
I feel very nervous when I heard the news about the DPRK's nuclear test. I hope the six-party talks are resumed to resolve this issue peacefully.
Experts are still skeptical as to whether Pyongyang's claim of a successful underground H-bomb test is true, but it could take days or weeks before this can be verified. Eugene Jung for CCTV, Seoul.
Beijing is among world capitals to sharply criticize that test. China's foreign minister even summoned the DPRK ambassador.
China has a resolute and clear-cut position on the relevant issue. That is to realize the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula and prevent nuclear proliferation, so as to maintain the peace and stability of Northeast Asia. We strongly urge the DPRK side to remain committed to its denuclearization commitment and stop taking actions that would make the situation worse.
China says Pyongyang conducted that test without informing Beijing. The test site, by the way, is only about 100 kilometers from the North Korea-China border. Residents and students on China's side of the border evacuated from buildings after feeling the tremors. China says it will test for radioactivity. The test prompted a closed-door emergency session of the UN Security Council. Although the test is not confirmed, the Council is already beginning work on another resolution.
This act is profoundly destabilizing for regional security and seriously undermines international non-proliferation efforts. I condemn it unequivocally.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe perhaps had one of the strongest condemnations, saying North Korea's nuclear test is a serious threat to our nation's security and absolutely cannot be tolerated. The United States also denounced North Korea's actions while also expressing skepticism about the claims. CCTV's Jessica Stone is at the White House. Jessica, what are you hearing from the Obama administration?
I think skepticism is a good word for it, Asiya, because despite these claims from the DPRK that they tested an H-bomb, the United States government says its intelligence does not indicate that. Take a listen.
The initial analysis that's been conducted of the events that were reported overnight is not consistent with North Korean claims of a successful hydrogen bomb test. There's nothing that's occurred in the last 24 hours that has caused the United States government to change our assessment of North Korea's technical and military capabilities.
Now, earlier today, the U.S. defense chief spoke with the defense chief of the Republic of Korea, and the partial readout of that phone call says in part that they reaffirmed that the international community does not and will not accept North Korea as a nuclear state, and pledged that both sides would coordinate appropriate alliance responses to these provocations. Now, of course, since the DPRK made the claim, there's really been a diplomatic frenzy here at the White House and around Washington, with folks from the State Department and the Defense Department and the White House all calling their counterparts in Japan, in South Korea, as well as in China. And in fact, just a few hours ago, we know that according to the White House, the National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, met personally with the Chinese ambassador to the United States, Cui Tiankai. Now, we also know that China, of course, shares a border with the DPRK and has sent representatives there, but it's unclear how much leverage it has with the DPRK. And Asier, there have been tougher calls around the world for tougher consequences against the DPRK, but it's really unclear what more can be done. This is a highly isolated, economically sanctioned nation, and we'll just have to see what comes out of the United Nations effort there. Meantime, there is a U.S. diplomat headed to the region next week to work on some more information in regards to what further sanctions and/or options the international community has.
CCTV's Jessica Stone joining us live from the White House. Thank you, Jessica. Now, along with international indignation comes global skepticism that Jessica mentioned about whether that test really involved a hydrogen bomb. Our correspondent Jim Spellman is here with me on the studio to dig a little deeper on the scientific end of all this.
Figuring out exactly what happened is not going to be easy for the international community. Some experts already questioning the DPR's claim of carrying out its first hydrogen bomb test because of the strength and if what went off was really a less powerful atomic explosion as opposed to a hydrogen bomb. Let's start by looking at exactly how nuclear tests of this sort work. First, a hole is dug straight into the Earth, some 200 to 800 meters deep. The hole is generally about 3 meters wide. The nuclear device lowered into the hole. The hole is then filled with sand and concrete. Monitoring equipment is encased in lead, and the device is remotely detonated. The explosion creates huge amounts of energy, triggering the seismic reaction that was detected around the world. The heat creates a center of molten rock. Once it cools off enough, they can dig another hole down there to retrieve samples. That's very important that it's so far underground. That's what makes it so difficult to detect whether this was a hydrogen bomb or an atomic bomb. That's very important. A hydrogen bomb, far more powerful than a simple atomic bomb. The H-bomb essentially uses an atomic bomb to trigger a larger thermonuclear explosion. So a failed H-bomb test might look similar to a successful A-bomb detonation.
The reported size of the detonation is relatively modest. It's comparable to the test that North Korea carried out in 2013, which I think has led many experts to assume that this is in fact probably a much cruder device rather than a fully fledged hydrogen bomb.
Japan has sent planes in the air to test for radiation as the international community tries to figure out exactly what happened.
So what kind of threat are we talking about with a weapon like this?
We don't know what went off, so we don't know how much damage it could do. But regardless of whether this was an A-bomb or an H-bomb, the next question is how might the DPRK use it as a weapon? First, it would have to be miniaturized into a warhead, then delivered to the target. Now, back in World War II, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Japan using airplanes. A more likely delivery system for the DPRK would be a missile. The DPRK is thought to have 4 main types of missiles: Seoul, Tokyo, Beijing, all fairly easily within range of their reliable missiles. Longer range but less reliable missiles may be able to hit India and Russia and could potentially even hit parts of the U.S. state of Alaska. That's not very likely, but definitely something the United States will take into consideration, Asier.
All right, CCTV's Jim Spellman. Thank you, Jim.